Hello, everyone. I'm Eva Heims, a senior lecturer in public policy at the University of York, and I'm going to tell you a little bit about the paper that I just introduced to you on those two slides, which I co-authored with my colleague Sophie Moxon, who is also here at the University of York with me. As you have seen on those two slides, the paper I'll talk to you about is all about regulatory capture, a topic that never loses its appeal or interest to many audiences, and we very much in our paper build on the contribution by Carpenter and Moss in the edited volume on wanting to take a more critical stance towards the social scientific study of regulatory capture, arguing that capture is often misdiagnosed or overdiagnosed, too many regulatory failures or dysfunctions, or outcomes that we or some people just don't like are attributed to regulators having been captured, i.e. excessively influenced by the industry they regulate. And while we think that that's certainly something that happens and that exists and that we need to be cautious about, it's also very important to distinguish captured regulatory processes from ones that haven't been captured, or more importantly, to start seeing capture as a grayscale where we may have elements of industry influence, but they may not amount to excessive influence to a degree that we can ascribe a bad regulatory outcome just to excessive industry influence, for example. And only if we understand better how industry influence comes to bear on regulatory decision making by regulatory agencies, which is what we're focusing on, can we move on to preventing capture, for example. So in our paper, we argue three things, really. First of all, we need to be careful not to misdiagnose and ascribe bad regulatory outcomes to capture. Second, to do that, we need to be aware that regulatory capture is not an outcome, it's a process, an outcome, a regulatory outcome. A decision that is in line with industry interests is by no means evidence of capture. To evidence capture, we need to show how the process of decision making was excessively influenced by regulated companies or the industry at large, and how that enabled to shift decision making away from the public interest towards the interests of these companies. And to do that, thirdly, we need to apply systematic process tracing and operationalize mechanisms of regulatory capture of industry influence and apply them in systematic empirical study. And in our paper, we do just that by looking at regulatory decision making on one particular pharmaceutical product, the painkiller Vioxx, that caused one of the biggest drug scandals of all time when it was withdrawn from the market in the early noughties after it became clear that it was causing heart attacks and strokes in a patient group that already had high cardiovascular risk factors, as it was mainly taken by older people who suffered from arthritis. So we chose a case like this, and it's part of a larger project in which we study cases such as this, where many people would agree the regulatory outcome was bad, and often, and in the case of Vioxx, that was also the case, people jumped to the conclusion that excessive industry influence must have been one of the main, if not the cause of this bad outcome. And so what we do is we study three mechanisms of regulatory capture in detail by operationalizing them through very detailed observable manifestations, namely the revolving door, information overload by the regulated industry or the company in this case, and cultural capture, so shared cognitive frameworks, shared networks, shared worldviews between the regulator and the regulated. And quite often the presence of these as such, which we argue are potential causes of capture, are seen as evidence for capture. Instead, we develop causal mechanisms showing how, for example, the presence of staff or key staff moving through the revolving door is not enough to evidence capture. Instead, we need to show how these key individuals had access to key decision-making moments and were able to decisively influence decisions in their favor and in the favor of the regulated company. And if we can evidence that, we can evidence a captured outcome. And we develop very detailed observable manifestations and then test these against a huge array of empirical documentary data of decision making by the UK pharmaceuticals regulators on the painkiller Vioxx. And by doing that, we can show that even though there's elements of all of these three mechanisms at play in decision making, we never, for neither of those three mechanisms, do we see a full mechanism of regulatory capture that would enable us to see that this was a captured regulatory process. We see a degree of industry influence, we see parts of these three mechanisms in action, but that does not amount to evidence of a strong degree of capture. So it gives us further evidence and further reason to believe that we need to be very careful in describing bad outcomes, regulatory outcomes to capture. And it gives us a template that we hope other researchers can use of how to use this type of very systematic and detailed process tracing for research on regulatory capture. So the three mechanisms we've developed could be transferred to other cases of regulatory decision-making, especially for product approval and supervision processes. One could use the mechanisms one-on-one probably that we've developed here, but other researchers can also take them as a model, develop them further, and develop other mechanisms, regulatory capture mechanisms on the basis of what we've done here. That's our hope. So it's very much part of an agenda that doesn't try to deny at all problematic and often systematic influence of industry on our economic and social institutions and life, but regulators get blamed very easily as being sort of the main culprits and targets of industry influence and the most captured institutions in our political systems. But in our case study, we show that regulators aren't defenseless of this and against this. In our case study, regulators at all times did their job by, for example, looking at all available evidence, always keeping an open mind towards thinking that Merck's interpretation of the data on the risks of Vioxx could be wrong. So we never saw that kind of complete shared mindset between the regulator and the regulated. And that's really important to note that regulators are defenseless and often try to do their job. What we did see was the regulator favoring evidence from randomized controlled trials, which are controlled by the industry, which is a shared scientific norm on the whole, but they did not favor RCT evidence to a degree that they easily dismissed other forms of evidence, for example, which is why in our paper we show that it was not cultural capture that caused this particular regulatory outcome. So we hope we have given you enough reason to want to have a closer look at the paper, and are very happy to receive comments and enter into discussion with anyone who's interested. Thank you very much for listening.